I looked at one potential cause of reduced trust in science, well, really in organizations and institutions generally, but I'm particularly interested in the declines we've seen toward epistemic institutions like universities, scientific journals, and scientists themselves over the past 10 or so years. And then particularly looking at politicization of organizations and institutions. So what I mean by politicization is essentially perceptions that political values are influencing an institution's work. So in the case of like science or university or academic disciplines, this would be the perception that scientists are not only pursuing truth, but their political values are also influencing the conclusions that they draw. And so I looked at this across many studies, I'm not sure how many, 7 or something. And in the earlier studies, we saw just with correlational results, so this is just looking at the associations between variables, that the more organizations and institutions and academic disciplines are perceived as allowing their political values to influence their work, the less people trust them. And this is a really, really, really strong relationship. Whereas when we look at just the political slant of organizations and institutions, are the people in those institutions left-leaning or right-leaning? There really is no reliable relationship there. Which is interesting because many people think that one reason people don't trust the science and scientists is because they're overwhelmingly left-leaning, but that is not having a major effect on whole. And what we're really seeing is when it seems as though those values are influencing scientists' work, that's what's really undermining trust. And we also tend to see this where outgroup members, of course, so if I'm a liberal and I'm evaluating a right-leaning institution, or I'm a conservative evaluating a left-leaning institution, we see larger effects. So the more institutions are politicized, the less people trust them. But we even see negative effects among in-group members. So if I'm a liberal and I think the discipline of psychology is made up of a bunch of left-leaning people, if I perceive political values as influencing their work, I still trust them less. So even if they're promoting the values that I share, I come to trust that discipline or institution or organization less. In later studies, we looked at the causal relationship. And so we looked at different kinds of organizations that made that took like political actions. So these included endorsing a political candidate, so endorsing Donald Trump or Joe Biden for president like 4 years ago. These included inviting political speakers to give talks at professional conferences, so inviting, I think it was a Republican or Democratic governor. And these included social media posts that reveal the political values of that organization. And what we see is that when these organizations make these political actions that signal their political values to the public, people come to trust them less. So there's a causal relationship here that when an organization, if I don't have much information about them, I just know they exist, I know what they say they're doing, maybe so in one case we had park rangers and they're trying to get people to visit national parks. One was an economics professional society, so they're supposed to be doing science and economics. If that's all I know about them, I trust them fairly highly, just by default. I have a tendency to sort of be trusting toward those groups. But as soon as they do something that signals political values, I come to trust them less. And we see that across these 3 different groups. After I had these results, I was prompted to do a literature review and look at what do people think, like why are leaders getting involved in politics? Why are they using their organizations to signal political values? What are the moderators of the costs of those? So like what predicts greater costs or fewer costs in terms of trust, but also things like support, willingness to defer to expertise, if we're talking about a commercial organization, desire to purchase their product, things like that. And we see a couple things worth noting. First, when it comes to contexts that moderate the relationship between political action and negative outcomes, although certain contexts minimize those costs, so for example, if you're a very small and unknown organization, you don't really have a whole lot to lose. And so it's relatively less risky for those kinds of organizations to make political statements or to, get involved in political matters. But across all the different contexts, what we see is some contexts reduce costs, but no contexts reliably create benefits. And so really looking across all the kinds of consequences that an organization can face from engaging in political action, they are almost all negative. And the best case scenario is not negative, it's neutral. And so this raises the question of why are these leaders getting their organizations involved in political matters, releasing political statements or signaling political values. And there are a couple of things that I think are interesting. The first was that scholars tend to attribute their behavior to public pressure to take a stand. And so there are these consultancy firms who have polled the public, and they find that the public want organizations to be taking a stand on social issues and political issues. But I find these recommendations to be overly simplistic and missing a really important feature of how political actions have to happen. It can't just be you're taking a stand. It has to be taking a stand on a particular issue, and taking a particular position on that issue, and then signaling it on a certain platform and with a kind of tone. And so once you go through that series of steps for take a stand to a specific political action, you cut the group of people who might support taking a stand maybe in half at every step, and you end up with a very small group of people. So we conducted a study to kind of, demonstrate that this kind of thing can happen by looking at people who support taking a stand, people who support taking a stand on particular issues, particular positions on different platforms. And we see that precisely this kind of thing happens. So even though quite a few people will support organizations taking a stand on, say, free speech or affirmative action or climate change, once you specify the position and where that message should be sent, you're cutting the support down to something like 20%. So even if 70% of people think combating climate change is important and organizations should be supporting that, when it comes to expressing that message in a particular way, very few people actually support it. And so I think this is a problem with these sort of broad recommendations to take a stand. They're really missing the nuanced ways that people want those messages to be communicated. And then we also wanted to look at a couple potential reasons why leaders might take these political stances. And we're looking at two. I'll talk about one just for the sake of time and interest. We're looking at something we're calling politicization blind spots. And this is the tendency for people to not recognize when their own behavior is signaling a political value. So we have a preliminary study where we're looking at a variety of different actions that people can take, something like, flying an American flag or being closed on Sundays, anything that has potential to be a political signal, but it's also kind of potentially subtle. And what we see is people, when they're perceiving a behavior that signals commitment to their outgroup. So if I'm a Democrat and I see American flag as a Republican thing, I'm more likely to identify that as a political action than a Republican who sees an American flag. And so people have a tendency to see actions that support causes they don't support as political, but actions that signal support for causes they do support as not political. And so we think this reflects people's tendency to believe that their own values are these kind of pan-human, human values, universal values that everybody holds, and thus they don't detect the possibility that their own behavior is potentially divisive and could be creating conflict in broader society. So that's one promising avenue we're following up on currently. And yeah, so that's it.